Okay, Rav Hosai, we're up to Kuf Gimel. No, I'm sorry. My mistake. We are up to Tzadi Beis. And we turned already to Tzadi Beis on the Beis. And we are 6 lines down from the top. Amalei Rav Mori bar Rochel l'Rav Ashi. I wonder what Rav Mori's father was like. Anyway, Achi Omar Amema. If you remember from yesterday, Shmuel was of the opinion that the Kiddushin of a Yevama Lashuk to an each Zar is a suffix. We're not sure whether or not there is Tfisas Kiddushin, like there is in Chayvei Lavan in general, or there's no Tfisas Kiddushin, as Rav would insist, based on a special Gzeras HaKosu derived from Losia Eishes Hames, Lo Teheba Havaya. And therefore, Shmuel requires that such a Yevama who got married to an Ish Zar would require a get, misafek, which, by the way, would mean that she cannot marry a Kohen. So her husband died. She fell for Yibum. Now she got married to an Ish Zar. Shmuel insists that he give her a divorce. And in such a case, even if, let's say, the Yavam would die, which would mean she never got chalitza, and now she wants to marry someone else, she can't marry anybody else who's a Kohen because she has to get a get from the Ish Zar. Now, I'm not sure, according to Shmuel, what would be the status of this woman if she had a bia with another man? And for that matter, the boa, what would be their status? I don't think that we could punish them because we have to worry about Rav. And Rav says that her marriage to the Isar is not valid because Ein Kedushin Tosim B'Yavam L'Shuk. Not only that, by the way, it would be Hasra Safek. You can't give her Hasra and a Safek. And we don't know whether she's married him. So if she would have a relationship with another man, now we could also ask another question. Does this man, I'm talking now about the Ish Zar that she married, does he have any obligations or any rights within the framework of marriage? And here I think we should apply the principle of Motzi Mechavel of Harayah. Like let's say, for example, she dies and she leaves a bomb of money. Who gets to inherit the estate? Her husband? Or shall we say no? The heirs of the woman are muhzakim on the Yerusha. And the burden of proof would be on this so-called Baal to prove that his marriage was valid. Shmuel is saying we need to get misafek, but really we have Rav to rely on that the marriage is not valid at all. He has no rights to the inheritance. And as far as obligations are concerned, can we bill him for mizonos to support his wife? Well, is it his wife or is it not? We have a doubt about that. So once again, she would be now on the other side. He's in the driver's seat and she wants to sue him for mizonos. And he could say, well, go prove to me that I'm married to you. And since Rav would hold that I'm not married to you, then I can pascha like Rav in this case, and therefore I don't have to pay you mizonos or any of the other chiyuvei ksuv. Omer of Ashi, Hashta the Amr Amema. Ilchus HaKavasi de Shmuel. Im Haya Yevama Kohen, Choletzla V'Sharyala. And what's the significance of the fact that her Yavam is a Kohen? So he can't marry her because she might be married and divorced from the Ishzar, according to Shmuel. So whereas according to Rav, Miyabim, according to Shmuel, Choletz. Does everybody follow that? It's a simple calculation. What are the options for the Yavam if he's a Kohen? Does he have the option of Yibum, or is he left with only one option, and that is Chalitza? The answer is simple. I don't even know why we need Rav Ashi for that. There's no option of Yibum here. Because according to Shmuel, she needs a get from the Ish Shalashuk, we'll call him, and therefore she's a Grusha. Again, a Suffolk Grusha, but a Grusha mitzad Suffolk is not allowed to marry a Kohen. So Yibum is not an option. But nevertheless, the Kohen will give her Chalitza. Now, she won't be able to marry a Kohen, but at least she can marry Yisrael because of the Chalitza. He says the following. Yevama sheniskachel lizar tzricha get, because that's how we pass like Shmuel. Im heid eid echad o shnayim shemeis baila lifnei misas b'noah v'nis'ah. So now we're going back to the case in our Mishnah, where she was misled to believing, based on the testimony of one aid or two aidim, that her husband died first and her son died second, or his son died first, which means there was no yibum. So she went, no zikasim. She went ahead and she married someone else. Arei mitzkareshes mizeh shenis'alo. Right, on the mistaken false premises, she got married to someone because she accepted that testimony to the effect that her husband died before her son died. And now she's going to need a get from the person that she married. Just 1 second. Right, because we're passing like Shmuel. So Shmuel holds that if she got married to someone without chalitza, then that marriage requires a get. And now she falls for Yibum. Now, why does she fall for Yibum? If her marriage to the Shuk is meaningless like Rav, then I understand she falls for Yibum. But if we're going according to Shmuel, and maybe we validate that marriage, yeah, but that marriage does not undermine Yibum. Well, wait a second. In a sense, it does, but she's going to require chalitza. Yibum is going to be impossible because she's married to another man. Albeit illegally, but nevertheless, if we recognize that marriage, because it's chayve lavin, and Shmuel is worried about that, then certainly the Yavam cannot be miyabim her until such time as she gets a get. But it seems that Rav Ashi is not focused on that issue of Yibum as a general question. But rather he's focused on the issue of Kohen. So wait a second. Since, according to Shmuel, she needs a get from, we'll call him Yitzchak, right? The guy from the children. Right? So therefore, she can't be married to a Kohen. I don't get it. I mean, she's not a Grusha yet at this point. But she can't marry him. She can't marry the Yovam because she's an H's each. Right? One side of the sum. So Yibum is certainly not an option. Now he gives her a get, and Yibum should be an option, but it's not an option because the Yovam is a Kohen. And there's a 50% chance, so to speak, that that get is a valid get, and if she's a Gush. Now, Rav Ashi adds two words at the end of his presentation. He says, Visharyale. Visharyale means that she's allowed to be married to that person from the shuk. Again, on the one hand, she needs chalitza. I mean, he married her before chalitza, but let's say under false premises, thinking that she did not fall for Yibum. Now we find out that she did fall for Yibum. She needs chalitza, but then she can go back to this husband. I'm not sure. Does he need a new kiddush? Maybe mitzad safek he would need a new kiddush because he married her before chalitza, and there's second he married her before chalitza. And according to Rav, let's say, which is one side in Shmuel, his marriage to her before chalitza was not valid. So it sounds like Sharyale means that he'll have to be Makadish her a second time around. His original kedusha might not be valid at all. But what I'm confused about is that we've discussed on many occasions that if a woman is married and on the false premises she married someone else, thinking that her husband was dead, and as it turns out her husband's alive, is teitze mizeh u'mizeh. We impose a knas, and she's not allowed to be married to that person with whom she had a marriage relationship that didn't exist. If we apply that to a case of Yevamot Lashuk, then before she married so-and-so, this Shuk guy, she should have been absolutely certain that her son died after her husband. Hence, there was no Zikas Yibum. Let's say that she didn't do her due diligence, certainly not in the case of Eid Echad, maybe even in the case of Shnei Eidim. Then we should apply the principle of Teitze Mizeh u'Mizeh. And would it make any difference insofar as she might be married to this guy, meaning that marriage before the chalitza possibly could have been a valid marriage, because Shmuel is in a suffix. We don't know if Yevamot Shuk is a valid marriage or not. Although, admittedly, according to Rav, on one side of Shmuel, it's not a valid marriage, but there's one side to say that it is a valid marriage. So let's say, for example, a man would marry a mamzeres and violate an Isur Lav, and Kedusha Tosu B'chayvei Lav. If theoretically we could find a way of removing that status of mamzeres, meaning in Chayvei Lav, if we could ultimately, as the time passes, remove the lav, would he be allowed to remain married to her, or to remarry? Yeah, to remain married. Or to force him to? Do we say Teitzim Yizeh Mizeh when the violation was only a lav? And here in this case, the violation is a lav, and now she gets chalitza, which removes the lav. Can he marry? So maybe Teitzim Yizeh Mizeh would not apply in this case, because we're not dealing with a situation where the marriage is completely ridiculous. I mean, it's an adulterous relationship with a nation siege, but rather it's a Yevamot Shuk situation. It's only Chayvei Lav. Now the Gemara says we have a kash on Rav Ashi with regard to this Shuk guy. It gure itkar. Right? It gure is the Aramaic word for schar, for wages or benefits. So this man, Min HaShuk, married Yevamot Shuk be'isur, and now we're going to allow him to remarry her or to remain married with her. Why does he deserve such benefits? And I think the Gemara is asking my question from before of Knas. We should say Teitzim Yizeh Mizeh. Now, the Masifta, in explaining these words of the Gemara's Kasha, adds a few v'lo birer karoi imachem muteres hi linaseh. Very similar to what we've been discussing in terms of Teitzim Yizeh Mizeh, that we impose a knas on her because she didn't do her due diligence. Now, I would agree in the case of Eid Echad, there's only one aide who testified that her son, or his son, right, outlived the father. How can you rely on one aide? There's too much at stake over here. And therefore, we should impose a knas on him and say, Teitzim Yizeh Mizeh, and he should never be able to marry. But if there were two Eidim that testified that her son died after her husband, and therefore she's not a Yevamot Shuk, this guy who married her, I don't know if you can blame him if two Eidim perjure themselves in a court of law. Imkain argues the Makshan against Rav Ashi, Matzinu Chote Niskar. He's a sinner and he's benefiting from his sin. How so? If he wouldn't have married her, then she could have fallen for evil. And then he would be completely out of the picture. The Yavam could have married her. The only reason the Yavam can't marry her is because he went ahead and married her. He robbed the cradle, so to speak. And according to Shmuel, in one side, we validate the marriage of Chayvei Lav, and in the case of Yevamot Shuk. And therefore, he made it impossible for Yibam to have taken place. And now what we're saying to him is, you know what punishment you're getting for an illegal marriage that made Yibum impossible? Because had you played by the rules of the book, the Yavam would have been Miyabim her. So we're going to give him, instead of Patch, we're going to give him a prize. We're going to say that the Yavam is a Kohen. You go ahead and give her a get. I'm sorry, and give her a get. And then the Yavam, because he's a Kohen, doesn't have the option of being the Abim. He can only give a Chalitza, and after Chalitza, we're gonna send her back to you, and you can continue your relationship with her. We are almost abetting in a crime. The man married a woman, made Yibum impossible. Now, what are we going to tell him? I mean, after all, we find out now that his facts were incorrect. She was, in fact, the Yavam Ashuk. He can't be made married to her. So now we're going to advise him, I got a plan for you. The Yavam's a Kohen. Give her a get. The Yavam will give a Chalitza because he doesn't have the option of Yibum. And then you can remain married to her. You know, we mamish fell into his pocket, into his hands. We're playing into his debt. We're setting it up in a way that what would have been impossible for him to marry her because Yibum would have taken place, we're setting it up in a way that Yibum could not take place because we're going to recommend or advise him to give a get. And instead, Chalitza will take place. And after Chalitza, he can remain married to her. That's called a Chote Niska. He's a sinner who, if he had played by the rules of the game, no way, no how could he have married her. The Yavam would have been Miyavim her. And now, because he went ahead and married her, he is now able to marry her. You follow, or remain married. Why? Because he didn't play by the rules and he violated a lav de oraisa of Yavam Ashuk. So the Gemara says we're going to have to change the formula of Rav Ashi. Ella, Rav Ashi is not talking about a Yavam who's a Kohen, but in Haya Yevama Yisrael, again, we have to change the text of Rav Ashi. The version of Kohen is incorrect, but rather Yevama was Yisrael. No say la sheni get v'hutra lo. Or Yavam is Yisrael, and he wants to be Miyavim. But in the meantime, she was married to so-and-so, right? A shukar. What we do is we're going to reinstate Yibum. How? Right now, Yibum is an impossibility because she might be an Ashish married to the shukar in one side of the shul suffer. But after he delivers the get, there's no issue of Ashish Ish, and we go back to square one, and the Yavam could be Miyavim. He gave her a get, so what? The Yavam is Yisrael, he's not a Kohen. What's the chiddush now of Rav Ashi in this reformulation of Rav Ashi? And I'm wondering out loud if there's maybe a Havamina that Yibum can't take place. Meaning, on the side that the Shuk marriage was valid, which is one side, she's out of the parsha of Yibum entirely. It won't help if he gives her a get. See, this touches on a sugya in the first parak of whole the Ishtrei Ishtrei. You remember that sugya? Because it could be that at the moment that Reuven died and Sarah fell for Yibum to Shimon, at that moment there's no Isra Eishes Ach, there's a mitzvah Yibum. Now this woman Sarah, who fell for Yibum to Shimon, gets married to Yitzchak. It could be that we don't recreate the Isra of Eishes Ach, even though Yibum is impossible, but rather we see the situation as a temporary blockage and Yibum is on hold. It's suspended in midair until such time as Yitzchak delivers a get. And now we have to figure out, do we force? Yeah, we have to force him to give her a get. Why? Because every moment he remains married to her, he violates the Isra of Lotia Ish Savei Sachutz Lishzar. But again, what would happen now if before he delivered a get, she received chalitza from the Yovel? Would she be able to go back to Yitzchak and resume her marriage? Wait, let's just see. See, if the Yovam is Yisrael, and he opted for what? He opted for chalitza. See, but he did have an option of Yibum, which was made impossible by Yitzchak. Yitzchak is, in a certain sense, a chotei niskar, even minus the kuhu. So let's assume that we're not going to apply the principle of Teitze Mizeh Umizeh if the Yavam opts for Chalitza, then it would seem that she could remain married to the Shuk, to the Yitzchak who was married. Because there's no din of Teitze Mizeh Umizeh. When did the Gemara insist that she cannot go back to the Makadesh, to this Shuk, we call him Yitzchak? That's only when he was a Chotei Niska. And he himself, by marrying her, made it impossible for her to have Yibum with a Kohen, because he has to give her a get. But in this case, if he gave her a get, and now the Yavam opts for Chalitza. Yeah. Right? What Rav Ashi is saying is that she goes back to the state of Yibum after Yitzchak delivers a get. I don't see a chiddush in that offhand. But maybe the chiddush is, or maybe we should just be mechadish this chiddush. I don't know if it's Rav Ashi, that in event that the Yom decides to opt for chalitza, she could go back and resume her marriage to Yitzchak, because we don't apply the principle of Teitze Mizeh Umizeh in the case of Chayvei Lav, namely Yavam L'Shuk. Now take a look at Rabbeinu Tam for a moment. In the bottom Tosfos here, Omer Rabbeinu Tam, the Irish and his kadsha v'lo nises. I wonder why Rabbeinu Tam insists that it's niskadsha v'lo nises. Let me just for a second, if you have the patience of this, open up to Urei Atos. Maybe he'll add something. And we're on Tzadi Beis on the Beis. He says, Irish in his kacha v'lo nises di oz lo shaychi atamim dilakamon li osra al baila. So if I understand correctly, Rabbeinu Tam is saying something which I think is a bit of a chiddush, that if a Yevamal Ashuk deliberately has a relationship with another man, then the principle of Sota, lesser al baila, of Tuma, applies, even though she's not married to the Yavam, but there's a Zika. This comes back to our whole discussion about Zika Sivu. He says, "V'hine b'hava min rotza gemara lomar im hoya baila kohen choletz lo v'sharyale maksha gemara im kei matzinu chote niskar mashva b'pashtus shenesro lezar v'im nefarish shemayri kan kach b'niskacho Im kein nilmad me'agemara the gam the ofen sharak niskacho li'acher v'lo nisa adayin nesra'o." Wow, this is brilliant. A whole mathematical calculation. I mean, the Gemara assumed that if the Baal was a Kohen, then after Chalitza she could not resume the relationship with this shuk, because then he would be a Chote Niska. Now again, if the Chote was only Makadish her, then we can derive the conclusion from this Gemara that even in the case of Niskad Shali Acher V'lo Nisadai, Nesra. Wow, that's a gewaltige chiddush. All right, so let's see where we got up to here. On Daf Tzadi Beis, Amid Beis, we're up to Amar Rav Gidol, Amar Rav Chia Bar Yosef, correct? A statement in the name of Ra. How far down is that? It's about halfway down the Amar, am I right? Okay. Right then?